So good morning, everybody. This is Monday, April 26th at Fashion Institute of Technology, and it's a great honor to have Professor JoanneBEicher. And the title of the talk is Ethnic Dress. So let's start with Professor Eicher.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here to be part of your class on the history of East Asian costume. Are you able to hear me all right now?
Yes, I can hear very well.
Great. My lecture is on ethnic dress to illustrate dress from cultures beyond East Asia. I begin by quoting from an earlier lecture of mine that I titled, and I quote, "Dress, Identity, Culture, and Choice, the Complex Act of Dress," unquote. In it, I stated, wherever we live on this planet, getting dressed each day helps us tell others who we are, usually without speaking to them, unquote. Now, I was emphasizing that a person's appearance helps us decide who that person is, giving clues about their gender, age, and other social factors, even before they begin to talk. In addition, our dress is also seen within a specific time frame and sociocultural space, providing context to our dress bodies and to establish our identity. Dress often silently and almost immediately communicates who we are to others, as I said. Some of you may have seen the recent Netflix documentary, Warren Stories, with many examples of how people see their dress as a critical part of their identity. I've been enjoying it, actually. Moving from your class focus on East Asian ethnic dress in China, Korea, and Japan, I present other cross-cultural examples. I draw from my West African research, particularly among one ethnic group in Nigeria, the Kalabari people. Over an 11-year period, I conducted long-term research with them. After my last visit, I have researched Kalabari dress at diaspora events in the United States. First, I want to point out that I prefer the word dress, not costume. I differentiate dress from costume, declaring that dress is a daily way of supplementing or modifying our bodies. In contrast, costume is what is worn for special performance activities, like roles performed for theater, dressing for Halloween, or dressing for masquerades. I have lectured before on ethnic dress, and audience members in those lectures thanked me for using the word dress instead of costume. One lecture I gave to African art colleagues, and another I lectured to students, and I was lecturing about my research on Hmong dress, and there were Hmong students in the audience. In both cases, audience members who commented claimed that they did not like what they wore to be described with the word costume. They emphasized that what they wore was not costume, but their dress. Now, in my first few comments, I used supplementing and modifying the body as two phrases in referring to dress as a daily act. And I include these two phrases as part of my definition of dress as, quote, body modifications and body supplements. This means being dressed involves more than wearing clothes. This next figure that you see before you depicts body supplements and body modifications regarding the many acts of dress. On the right, you see body supplements in a dark orange block listing types of supplements around it. So on the top, you see handheld objects, objects held by oneself or by others for the person. These items include attaché cases, handbags, and umbrellas. In the case of African royalty and the President of the United States, for example, umbrellas are held for them. And I think we will see that slide in the next one with President Obama. Yes. And so then I think we can go reverse so that we can see, but you can see that in African royalty and also for presidents of the United States, things like umbrellas, they do not carry for themselves. Someone has to hold them. So, okay, we're going back now, right here. We're right at the right place. The next type of body supplement is attachments to the body. And these are like earrings inserted or clipped to the ear, or an Indian married woman's adhered bindi is what it's called. It's the red dot that you will see placed in the middle of an Indian woman's forehead. And third is enclosures to fit the body, whether they're wrapped around, suspended like capes or shawls from the shoulders, or pre-shaped, which we usually call being cut and sewn or being tailored garments. Finally, the last category is attachments to body enclosures like military badges, or most often jewelry items like decorative pins or brooches. Now, at the left of the image you're looking at is the category of body modifications. These are the transformations we can make to our hair, skin, nails, eyes, and teeth. We may use implements to brush or comb our hair, may add a tattoo, as in this example, and you can move forward to the next one, and then we'll move back again. No, that should be forward. Yes, there you see a tattooed arm. Or we can apply scent to our skin and color our hair, lips, or nails, and even spray our breath with breath freshener. Also, we can change our body's muscular and skeleton system. We can diet, exercise, or wear supplements that constrain the waist or bind the body. And there can be combinations. Now, all of these modifications are part of the act of dress. Now, next, I want to talk about our senses being involved in relationship to body modifications and body supplements. So you can go forward to the slide about the senses. Dress is usually thought of as visual because we see dress, but our dress may also be smelled. We can add odors with perfumes, aftershave lotions, and scented textiles. And often people alter their body odor by bathing, showering, or using deodorant. The sense of touch is involved, like when we touch our skin, whether soft or dry, or when we feel the texture of cloth, whether soft velvet or something rough jeans, rough tweed. Sound is also involved when we wear charm bracelets, or in this example next that I'm showing you of an Ojibwe jingle dress, or when we hear rustles of a taffeta skirt or the click of high heels on a hard floor. Even taste can be included if using flavored lip balm or chapstick. I now move from a discussion of the senses involved in dress to how body supplements and body modifications become important in regarding ethnic dress. For example, the body can be modified with a tattoo, like those of the Maori of New Zealand, or by supplementing the body when we wear a significant textile. You've heard of the Scottish tartans. Accessories can also be an item of dress, like beads or a hat, as I will indicate later in my comments. Thus, both body modifications and body supplements may signify ethnicity. Usually, this means that both the wearer and anyone viewing the wearer share and understand that those supplements and modifications are ethnic. And in this case of the Ojibwe jingle dress that you're seeing, when people go to one of these American Indian festivals, they of course see that as an Ojibwe jingle dress, so they identify it that way. What is an ethnic group? Since I've been talking about ethnic dress. In my article on ethnic dress in the Berg Encyclopedia and in Valerie Steele's Companion to Fashion, I state that that people in an ethnic group share a cultural heritage or historical tradition. Their ethnic dress stems from their heritage or their tradition relating to geography or language. Also, ethnic dress may be one item, or it could be a whole ensemble, with the ethnic group's language designating the item or the ensemble. And again, with looking at the jingle dress, we see that in essentially it's a whole ensemble. Now, getting back to your class, your syllabus indicates that you began by studying Japanese material, culture, and dress, starting with ancient Japan and the kimono as example. You moved into Korea, starting with ancient Korea. I listened to Minji Kim's lecture on Korean dress, and I have traveled to Korea and I'm familiar with and have seen hanbok. Whether or not you have Japanese or Korean ethnic heritage, you have knowledge from your class about kimono and hanbok. In addition, if you're Korean, you know how a single item, such as noragai, the pendant, is related to hanbok. If you come from a non-Asian background, perhaps German or Austrian, you might be familiar with dirndls, a type of women's dress, or lederhosen, men's leather shorts. Even if you are not German or Austrian, you may have seen the movie Sound of Music, with characters wearing examples of both. My point is that words like kimono, hanbok, noragai, dirndls, and lederhosen refer to ethnic dress. The significance of ethnic dress means that the insiders, the ethnic group members, know what their ethnic dress is and normally take it for granted. They often expect outsiders to recognize their ethnic dress too. For example, if this woman who's dancing in front of us with her jingle dress were walking down the street and people from the Midwest had seen American Indian dance festivals, they would recognize it as a jingle dress outfit. Sometimes, however, an ethnic group wears what they consider our dress, their dress, but they don't realize that others may not recognize it. I will share an example later from my Nigerian research. First, I want to present background facts about the Kalabari people of the Niger Delta, who share a language and come from a specific geographic area. I'm starting with this slide. I'll have another, but this one shows a map of Nigeria, and it shows Nigeria in relationship to the rest of the African continent, located, as you all know, in West Africa. And as you know, there are 52 countries in the continent of Africa. So this slide shows a detail down to the left of where the Kalabari live. It's about 4 degrees above the equator on islands among mangrove swamps nestled in the tributaries of the Niger River. The climate is tropical, an important point to remember when you see examples of their dress. The second map that I'm showing next outlines Nigeria. You can move ahead, right? That's correct. and shows the two major rivers, the Niger and the Benue, and they join to become the Niger River as it flows into the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see the delta area there on the outline of the map of Nigeria. Now, the Kalabari have not been agricultural. They have fished, they've produced salt from seawater, they traded with the British Commonwealth traders beginning in the mid-18th century, and their trade became very important. Through trade, they bought many imported textiles, especially from India, that soon became part of their cultural heritage, including their ethnic dress. In the 21st century, they are bilingual. They speak English as their primary language because they learn it in primary school as well as learning Kalabari at home. They wear Western clothes, usually daily. Many travel to the United States and Canada for university education and professional work, and frequently stay to work and become citizens, and they try to return home as frequently as possible. In Nigeria, they practice masquerading and conduct elaborate funerals based on their cultural heritage, and often continue these in North America. I researched their masquerades and funerals during my Nigerian fieldwork of 8 trips. I have also attended 4 Kalabari events in the United States, observing Kalabari commitment to wearing their ethnic dress frequently. In looking at this outline map of Nigeria, you can see why the country used to be divided into northern, western, and eastern regions. Really, it was based on the way that you see the rivers, so that above the place where the rivers join, yes, was the northern, and then you see the western on your left and the eastern on your right. So these corresponded to the location of the 3 largest ethnic groups among the 250 linguistic groups in Nigeria, which I've indicated form the base of being an ethnic group. The 3 major Nigerian groups are the Yoruba of the West, Igbo of the East, and the Hausa of the North. In regard to dress, Nigerian women, like most West African women, wear cloth called a wrapper in English or panier in French. A wrapper is cloth wrapped around the body, either from their breast to ankles or from their waist to ankles. The latter sometimes being 2 pieces, which you'll see later, then called a wrapper set. In early times, women were bare-breasted, but then they began to wear blouses with the arrival of and the influence of Christian missionaries. Men in the West and East also wrapped a textile around their waist, often worn with an upper garment, such as a shirt or a longer gown over the wrapper. Men in the North, primarily Muslim, wore a long gown of several styles to the ankles, often called the kaftan. Many men in the 21st century wear these upper garments over trousers instead of a wrapper. The image you have in front of you is an example of Yoruba dress, a Yoruba wrapper, which this woman is wearing tied from her breast to her ankles. And head wraps, as she has on, are common. The cloth she wears is a Yoruba indigo tie-dyed fabric that I'll show you in the next slide. Note that the color can be related to dress, and here you see that you see the tie-dyed fabric. You see the fabric that's been tied, not dyed, in the front of on the bottom of the slide. And then on the top, you see that it's been dyed, and actually there's been another color added as well. So the color can be related to ethnic dress because the woman's wrapper of indigo is typical of Yoruba color preference. along with commonly worn red and burgundy commercial print fabrics. Some of you may have heard of African print fabrics. But the Yoruba indigo wrapper is on a plain woven cotton. Sometimes it's a commercial textile that they bought that they then hand dye. In contrast, the Igbo do not dye indigo cloth, and when wearing commercial print textiles, strongly prefer orange, yellow, and many shades of green, not blue. An Igbo woman could wrap her cloth in the same way, but it would not be the same type of cloth or color. Thus, color and textile types can relate to ethnic dress. In this example, you are seeing that some Igbo women are known for their weaving of a textile named after one of the eastern area towns, and this town where this woman weaves is called Akwete. This slide shows this weaver hanging the wrapper set that she wove from her porch railing. And the next slide shows the simple loom she used to weave that textile. Now, the next slide shows a Kalabari woman wearing a typical West African woman's wrapper and blouse. You would find women, you would find Igbo women, you would find Yoruba women, you can go to Ghana, and you would see this wrapper and blouse outfit, often with two wrappers, one wrapped on top of the other. However, what's interesting about this photograph, this Kalabari woman, although her wrapper and blouse is typical of what West African women wear, her ethnicity as a Kalabari woman is shown by her textile. So the textile that she used for her wrapper indicates that she's Kalabari. Although the textile is imported from India, the Kalabari claim it as Kalabari. They call it ours because they cut a design by subtraction on it and they call it Kalabari textile. Its history is that they imported textiles from India when they became involved in global trade. At some point, a woman chose a piece of Indian madras and became inspired to make new design on it. She used a needle and lifted white or bright threads, cutting each thread on two ends with a razor or a penknife blade, and you'll see that in the next slide. Here you see an example, a woman with her hands, and if you look carefully, it's quite hard to see the needle. She's holding it in her hand, but you see the razor blade, or she might use a penknife blade. Then she lifts up one thread, just one thread, and she'll cut it at one end and then another end, so it'll be a short piece, and then she will begin to pull it out. Now, based on finding the cloth from the mid 1890s, 1880s, sorry, yes, that's really good to highlight that. Thank you. So my colleague and I, that I'll talk about in a minute, researched the wardrobes of these Kalabari women, and we found one that they could date back to about the 1840s, 1850s. So we see that the history of these probably dates back to the mid 1880s. So it appears that women have been doing this since then. My colleague, the deceased, now late, Dr. Tony Arikasima, was both Kalabari and he was a scholar. And he researched this whole process with me, and he developed a concept he called cultural authentication to describe this process of borrowing an item and transforming it, just as you see this was transformed by cutting. The process of cultural authentication occurs when a borrowed object is selected from another culture and changed enough to become identified, used, and given a name in Kalabari in this case, or in the borrowing culture. In the Kalabari case, and now you can go to the next slide, the Indian madras with some white and bright threads removed. So you see a piece of it, a large piece of it on the left, and you see it leaves some dark and shadowy areas, and it has a new design, thus becoming culturally authenticated. This cut work on madras, and this is a very important point, is not found anywhere else in the world. In the example, you see it with the threads cut and removed in terms of the general pattern. And on the right, in the detail, you see that some white threads remain next to the cutout spaces and the shadowy areas. The dark areas are only where the single dark threads remain. The Kalabari call this, in their language, paletibite, meaning cut thread cloth in English. In this next slide, you can see cut thread wrappers worn by Kalabari women walking in a funeral parade. So I took this photo when I returned for field work, but I first saw women wearing such wrappers when I was invited the first time when I lived in Nigeria for 3 years, and I was invited for a weekend visit, and I saw women wearing these wrappers. When I saw them, my knowledge of textiles meant that I identified them because they were plaid and checked. I identified them as Indian madras, and I asked some questions about them and wearing them. And I was told, "That's our cloth, madam," which I didn't understand. I was really very puzzled because I knew it as Indian madras. When I left Bugama on that first visit, one piece of the puzzle fell into place when my Ericasima host family gave me 2 pieces of indigo and white check, a wrapper set. And actually the check that I showed you before was a photograph of the wrapper set that they gave me. I really was happy to add it to my growing collection of Nigerian textiles because I had been traveling the country and collecting textiles which were handcrafted across the country. When home, I realized that there were designs on the textiles, small cut areas. I became even more curious. Later, when I returned to the United States, this was from living in Nigeria in those 3 years, a textile expert colleague said it was the most unusual textile of my collection, which really made me more curious. Knowing nothing about how it was made or its significance, I decided to conduct research, and I returned for fieldwork several years later, and I continued my research for a total of 8 trips, discovering more and more data about Kalabari culture, textiles, and dress. On my first return, I met the woman in the next slide that I'm showing you and found out that she was an expert and taught young women how to make designs. Here, she's not only wearing a wrapper that she cut herself, and then she's holding another textile of her design. So you have a nice example of both the indigo check that she's wearing and then the much larger pieces that she's showing of red and white and indigo madras. I also found out that cut thread cloth was an example of Kalabari ethnic dress that outsiders didn't recognize, partly, I think, because the design by subtraction is so subtle, as you could see when you saw the close-up. While attending an elaborate Kalabari funeral for an elder during one of my field trips, I sat by a man from a neighboring ethnic group. Remember, I said there were 250 in Nigeria, but this was another group in the Niger Delta called the Nembe. I found out he was a close family friend of the deceased. He and the chief mourner, the son of the deceased, had been trained as surveyors in Scotland, and he had visited Bugama many times. He asked why I was there. I told him I knew the family and I was researching the cut thread cloth wrappers, and I mentioned the name Paletibeti. Although he was Nigerian, and as I said, he had visited Bugama often, he had never heard of Paletibeti, and he didn't know what it was or he didn't recognize it when it was being worn that night. An example sometimes of ethnic dress being known only to the insiders. Another twist was that the Kalabari had no idea that their cut thread cloth was unusual and specific to them. This was even true for Dr. Eric Kasima, who had first invited me to Bugama to visit. He knew about wearing it and perhaps had seen women making it. Actually, I know he had because I visited a woman on his family compound and she was making it, but he had no detailed knowledge of it. So consequently, as I began my own research, I encouraged him to collaborate in the research with me. We worked as a team of insider and outsiders and began to document the importance of textiles in Kalabari culture. Our research covered analysis of Kalabari gendered dress and the importance of textiles and dress in Kalabari funerals and masquerades. I consequently launched research on Indian textiles by making trips to India. My graduate advisees also pursued paths that I knew I would not have time to cover. And so these areas that they followed included in-depth research on Madras. One student went to India. On velvet, another student went to India. On coral beads, which the Kalabari wore profusely, and so another student went to Italy, right below Naples. And then we conducted research on Kalabari women and men's dress. Tonya Ericasima, my collaborator, did the work on men's dress, and then 3 students did work on Kalabari women's dress. For my lecture today, I will summarize and give you just a few examples of Kalabari ethnic dress, primarily related to the textiles and the Kalabari prestige rankings for males and females. To begin with, and here you're seeing an illustration that I'll explain in a minute, the Kalabari see age grades, that is chronological age, as ranked from young to old, with older age being ranked higher for both males and females. For females, as you see illustrated here, ranking relates to biological life stages. For male, the political position is what relates. Now go back to the female dress slide, please. So in this slide, as you go from the small girl at the left, and notice how they use, it's very common for them to use beads around their knees, but the small girl at the left is wearing just a small piece of cloth. And as you go on and you do not look, I'm not focusing now on the extreme right, but if you go to the one second from the right, that is the outfit, the ensemble of a married woman. So a married woman wears this two-piece outfit, and then a married woman who's had a child wears the one on the right, which is a celebratory outfit. Now, either a married woman who has not had children yet, or a married woman with a child, is ranked higher than younger females and girls. So here you see all 5 stages, and you see the bottom of the stages begins with small girls before puberty, dressed in small pieces of cloth. And as they age, then it goes to short wrappers. And so there's a slight distinction between the second one from the left and the third. And finally, you see the full-length wrapper and blouse, as I discussed. And then the one on the extreme right is what she wears after she's born a child. Now, this whole scheme of illustrations represents research that was done intensely by one student, and then the whole area of what women wear after they're married and so on was done by another student. So next I contrast male stages of dress with these female dress stages. Now this is very interesting because look carefully at this illustration and you will not see any small boys at the extreme left, because here males as young adults, the young men are the ones who begin the stages of dress that are important. So the ranking continues from young men to the next is gentleman, and then chief, and then king. So the second from the right is the outfit that the king would wear, and the one on the extreme right is the celebratory gown worn when a man becomes installed as a chief, or it can be worn for a funeral of an esteemed elder worn by the male mourner. So now the interesting thing about the king's madras gown is it's surprisingly considered the most prestigious, even though both the textile, which is just a simple, very lightweight cotton madras plaid, seems very simple, and the design of the gown that he wears is very simple. In all cases, they're wearing wrappers as an underneath outfit. So this gown that the king wears is much more simple or ordinary than the velvet celebratory one. The dress is designated for both male and female rankings is part of Kalabari ethnic dress. The celebratory dress for both male and female is saved for special occasions only, and Kalabari do not consider any of these items of dress as costume. That word is used only for what Kalabari masqueraders wear, another area of research that we conducted on Kalabari use of imported textiles and other items. I move now to describe textiles related to these male and female stages. The cotton check or plaid textiles for the king's gown. Here you see the king that I was introduced to on my first visit in 1966. I've not yet discovered the reason why this simple cotton fabric is used for the king's gown. I think maybe it could be because it was perhaps one of the first articles that they traded, that they received in trade. And so maybe it became prestigious because it was one of the first. An interesting point, just as an aside, is that when the Kalabari traders began to receive some of their traded items, they often gave them their own names. So they would call it the John Bull cloth or the Jack Reese cloth or something, because they made a claim to it as having been the first ones to have purchased it. Well, purchased it, they traded things. It wasn't really a money purchase. So another Indian fabric that I've referred to now that's considered Kalabari ethnic dress is the exact opposite of this simple gown. It's the heavy velvet textile embroidered with gold or silver thread. Here you see it and worn by a man, and he's holding a very elaborate fan that's also velvet that has gold fringe around it. And I would just like to have you note that he's holding, or has on his shoulder a piece of, he has a piece of Indian madras. And this shows the prestige of Indian madras throughout Kalabari culture, because when this was a dance at a funeral celebration. And so they give gifts to the family, and one of the honored gifts can be the imported Indian madras textile. So also note that he's wearing a very elaborate hat, which I'll discuss in a minute. Now, one of the points I wanted to make about wearing this velvet cloth is that what people wear does not always coincide with the climate. You can imagine wearing a heavy velvet gown or wrapper on a hot and humid equatorial day. I'd like to point out that with the current fashion that we have of women, let's just say New York women, going bare-legged and wearing a heavy winter coat, that heavy winter coats on a very cold winter day in Manhattan and bare legs and high heels aren't necessarily related to climate either, as we all know. So now, moving to the next slide, and this extravagantly decorated hat. This is a hat that's found only among the Kalabari. It has a crescent-shaped base that's borrowed from the English, and it's a wonderful example of cultural authentication, because this hat always has the feathers on the top. And then if you look carefully to the left, embedded kind of in the middle is like a target shape. And that has a Kalabari name. It's called Biaba. And then if you could see, if you got up close, you can see that they're almost things like little girls' barrettes and little pins and so on. And so here this is, many borrowed things that have made this elaborate hat that's called, that's used by the Kalabari to wear with these extravagant velvet gowns. Now, in the next slide, you'll see that women wear these velvet wrappers. The velvet wrapper on the left was worn by a friend of mine who helped me with my research. It's a double wrapper set. And I mentioned the coral. You can see her coral hat. You can see the extravagant coral around her neck. And she has some on her wrists. And her daughter, standing next to her, has coral, and she's also wearing a very interesting wrapper, short wrapper that is of silk. I'll show you a copy of that too. So, but notice her hat, and we will move on. So this is another example of a double wrapper set of that silk cloth that does come from India. Again, you see the coral and so on. But now I'm going to turn to an accessory, a Kalabari accessory, the hand-blown bead. I showed this slide before, but I want you to focus on the hat that's made of beads worn by the young woman on your right. When I took this photo, I said to my friend that I had thought I had seen the same hat the day before, and I had taken a picture the day before. by this woman who's dancing in the masquerade. And my friend said, yes, it was the same hat. She made it with beads that she said were owned. She used that word, owned, by her birth family. And her birth family's name was Jack Reese. She called it owned by her family because she said people from other families were not entitled to wear it, could not and should not wear it. The woman at the masquerade that you see here was her sister, and the young woman standing beside her was her daughter in the other picture. Jack Reese's family members were the only ones allowed to wear this bead based on the family story about her Jack Reese ancestor and owning the bead. He was said to be such a rich man that he claimed he could buy many, so many of these glass beads that he could stamp on them and still have more for his family members to wear. She said the beads are imported, but she did not know where from. The example of these imported hand-blown beads is a specialized example of ethnic dress that belongs to a specific family. I tried to do research on the origin of the beads, trying to find out where they were made, but so far I have uncovered very little. I have a book on beads that had a photograph of one of them and identified it as Venetian. I wrote a research grant to travel to Venice, which I did, and I went to the island of Murano where they blow glass, and I found no evidence there. I only saw a somewhat similar bead sold as an earring to tourists. Perhaps the Jack Reese beads are from Austria, another source of hand-blown glass beads. But so that right now is at a dead end. But anyway, in another example of a specific type of Kalabari family dress, I photographed two women wearing textiles that the Horsfall family owned. Again, they said they owned the wearing of this textile. These heavy cotton striped wrappers, I believe, are from India, based on my research in India. And still another example of family dress, I was told that some cut thread patterns were owned by specific families, and those textiles could only be worn by them. To conclude, I have illustrated several types of ethnic dress and textiles of the Kalabari people of the Niger Delta of Nigeria. The textile examples are Indian madras, Indian striped silk, or Indian heavy embroidered velvets, all worn by Kalabari males and females. In addition, a special category of ethnic dress may exist when a family within a larger ethnic group lays claim to a specific accessory like the Jack Reese bead or the horsefall striped textile you see here. My lecture began with an introduction distinguishing dress from costume, with dress being worn on a daily basis and costume worn for special performance. I defined an illustrated dress as body modifications and body supplements and presented the idea that dress relates to all five senses. Ethnic dress is identified as worn by a specific group, usually thought of easily identified by ethnic group members as well as outsiders. Sometimes, however, this may not be true. Also, a family within an ethnic group may identify a special accessory or textile as being worn only by them. I'd like to say that ethnic dress can be a rich area for research. I discovered this when I was first invited to the island of Bugama in Nigeria for a casual weekend. It was an area of Nigeria that was new to me, and I had no idea what would follow. In addition, I learned to work as a member of an outsider and insider team, in learning about a culture and ethnic dress. Researching dress and textiles can be an introduction to many facets of life in any culture. I thank you very much for this invitation to lecture, and if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eicher. So let me end the show, but students, if you want to save this email address, you can save the email address and write to Professor Eicher. So let me end the show. And
I
then
appreciate it.
I'll stop sharing. Okay, so now we are back to the grid, right? So everybody can see each other. So you can, share. You can turn on your camera if you want, so that Professor Eicher can see enthusiasm on your face. Anyhow, so before I take questions from the audience, do you have any question, Professor Kawamura? Hold on, I have to unmute. So hold on, Professor, you need, no, you can talk.
I can mute. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Joanne, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. I love all of your works, and I just want to, I have actually, some questions, if time allows. My first question is that, one of my favorite articles of yours is Eurocentrism in the study of ethnic dress.
Yes, yes.
And we actually read it, in my both undergraduate and graduate classes. And I think you wrote that article in the 90s, if I'm correct.
Yes, it was very early. It was at a time when a lot of people who were studying the history of dress, and they liked to call it costume at that time, were very fixated on, well, it made sense. They were fixated on what they had in museum collections, and mostly museum collections had Western dress, So that's why, I collaborated with two graduate students at the time to write that, because we thought that what existed in museum collections wasn't everything that needed to be known about the concept of dress, and and we didn't believe in calling it costume either. But anyway, go ahead.
Yes, and in that interesting article, you talk about the marginal placement of ethnic dress studies in academia.
Yes.
And I was wondering, it's been like 2 decades since then, and you have, written and edited like countless, books and articles and, so many publications out there. I mean, do you see any changes since then? Is
I
ethnic
guess, I think what we need to answer that question, I think somebody would have to do a survey of the places where history of dress is taught. When I came back from Nigeria, then I taught a course on African dress. I was at Michigan State University then, and I taught a course on African dress and textiles, and I brought that course with me to Minnesota when I moved to Minnesota. Then when I went to Oxford University in the UK for my sabbatic, and I returned back to University of Minnesota, I decided at that time I would teach a course on ethnic dress so that students could pick their own examples from around the globe. But I did teach a course again on African dress. I've had a couple of students who've told me in the past that because they wanted to take a course with me and they took a course on African dress, they did so, but in the beginning they were kind of either reluctant or annoyed because they didn't care that much about Africa, and they thought, why should they take a course on African dress? After they took the course or got into the course, then they told me that they realized that by studying dress and textiles, you could find out something about any culture. That's why I made that point at the last of my last sentence in my presentation today. Because if you find out how people are using what they wear, or even household textiles and so on, celebratory textiles, then you begin to find out about their cultural practices. So anyway, I kind of wound around on the answer, but that was really one of the reasons is that well, that was first answered. I don't know how many other places are really studying ethnic dress. You will know, or I think maybe the class knows, that Abby Lillithon and Linda Welters did do this recent publication, The History of World Fashion. And I had worked with them. We did a couple presentations at Costume Society and ITAA, and they wanted to highlight the fact that, you know, there's more than Western dress to study in the world. So, but I think a survey would be the only way we would find out. And I think it's really good that at FIT you have this course that's looking at East Asia. So thank you for commenting on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, one more question, if it's okay with Kyunghee. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I love to know your thoughts, Joanne, about the recent heated debates on cultural appropriation.
Oh, you want? Go ahead.
As you know, young people are really sensitive about cultural appropriation issues.
Yes.
The example you just talked about, the Kalabari dress getting inspired by Indian Madras check. I think the youngsters might say, oh, the Kalabari people stole ideas from the Indian textiles. But I do like your concept of cultural authentication process. Sometimes I wonder, is there such a thing as like real authentic dress?
Well,
but I would love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I've thought a lot about it, and I haven't taken the time to write something about it. There's a real difference to me between cultural appropriation and cultural authentication, because appropriation is just borrowing something. I mean, I think all of the hubbub, I guess might be a word, about athletic teams, having names that are inappropriate, as people think, by just taking an American Indian name, indigenous Indian name, whatever. That is, cultural appropriation is almost just like stealing. You just take it over. That's all you do. And that's why people no longer like the idea of dressing up as in a Sioux Indian or Dakota Indian chieftains, feathered headdress or something at Halloween, something like that. But appropriation and authentication are different in the sense that with the Kalabari, they selected, you can use the word borrowed, but they selected the textile. Mm-hmm. And then they transformed it. So it was no longer used in the same way. I mean, as far as we know, well, when they traded, when they did their trading and they received the Indian madras, they didn't receive any that were cut and drawn. Mm-hmm. Somebody was creative, got inspired, something. And so authentication is when you change it. So it's not like it was before. It's similar because it's got the basic thing, but there are many things really that have been authenticated and are not really appropriated, So I think it's a very fine distinction, very, by maybe fine isn't quite very small, I don't know quite the right word now, but there is a distinction. There is a differentiation between authentication and appropriation. And I think it's fine for young or old. I don't care who's sensitive about appropriation, but there are ways of being inspired. And I think one of the things we do have to realize is that human beings are creative. They've always been creative. And one of the things, I did write a small introduction for a book that National Geographic published called Fashion. And the book was written by a National Geographic staff writer, but they asked me to write an introduction. And it's mainly a book of photographs. But in it, I did say that human beings have always been creative. And I didn't say this, I don't think I used this exact example, but because we don't know, we don't have anything except oral history in some cases. So, and we don't have photography until the middle of the 1800s. So we don't know how early human beings were creative about how they wore their leaves or whatever they were, what they did to their furs or whatever. But so people borrowing or selecting things, it's kind of natural. Human beings just seem to be creative. They see things, they borrow things, they change them. So that's kind of going on and on about it. But I think appropriation and authentication can be quite different.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Joanne. That's really helpful. Thank you
For asking.
Yeah, thank you.
So Professor Eicher, I have a student named Madeline Schlesinger, and she's waiting to ask you a question.
Good.
So Madeline, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Hello, Professor Eicher. First of all, thank you for the lecture. It was great. Learned a lot of new things, and I took a lot of notes. But anyways, so I had a question when you were going over like gender dress in Africa. You know how we went over girls before puberty, they wore something like a certain garment, or but like we didn't really go over the boys before puberty. So my question is, did the boys and the girls wear the same thing before puberty? Like,
no, little girls, that was before puberty. Those little girls were wearing just like a little piece of cloth. No, actually, boys and girls, I guess like maybe toddlers, were pretty much naked, and I don't know, as the West, as they've become more, and this is kind of hard to put dates on it, but I mean, I lived there in the 60s. Okay. I went back in 1980 and made 8 research trips from 80 to 91. And I haven't been back for that long, which is really a long time now, but I've been to these Kalahari events here in the United States. But I saw little kids, running around who were like toddlers. Obviously, they can't run unless they're a toddler or walk, who are running around without clothes. We see that here too sometimes at the beach or something, not often. But the important thing was that when I was there, kids were going to school. And so and they did go to kindergarten and so on. And so then they wore, mostly they wore school uniforms. This system of dress that I showed you is kind of the quote unquote traditional system that they had, distinguishing these stages of dress. And now the young woman, my former student, Dr. Catherine Daly, who did her field work there, would say herself, if she were doing this lecture, which she could, but she would say herself that the only things left of those stages of dress for women, which is really important because I'll say something about men in a minute, but really are what the women wear, the wrapper set, as you see, second from the right, and then very often the one on the extreme right, that's worn for all kinds of celebrations. That woman is called an iriabo, a woman who's gone through the process of iria, which means that she's had a baby and she's actually been sequestered and so on. But all of those other stages really happen occasionally if there's a big celebration. But today, little girls and adolescents and so on don't dress like that. That was kind of the traditional system that they still understand, they still remember it. Actually, they'll dress kids like that at a big festival time. Now, for boys, boys just were considered, they just were dressed up in Western clothes, I guess. The importance in men's dress begins with a young man. And the Kalabari, this goes off on another little tangent. It's hard to summarize, cultures in just a few paragraphs and so on. But the Kalabari are very prestige oriented. So when I called them on the left, the young men, in Kalabari, the phrase really means the young men that matter. Now, I think the reason it's called the young men that matter, then it sounds like there's some that don't matter. And probably that's true. I think the young men that matter were young men from the important families. The Kalabari, I'm sorry to say, did do slave trading. They did bring people down from the northern part of Nigeria, and during their trading times, they were trading human beings, which then they stopped, But they also brought these people that they might trade. They also brought them and made them members of their family. But when they were members of their family, they were not the birth members of their family. And so I believe that that's why they used the phrase, the young men that matter, meaning these were the birth members of the family. So this takes us off on a little tangent. The important thing is that because these are political positions, it's like who you are socially, that they didn't start distinguishing the types of dress for men until you're young adults. I think that's the point, Does that partially answer your question?
It like it I was just curious as to why the importance of a woman's dress starts from when they're really young, like before puberty.
Well,
but then
because it has to do with biological development. She's a little girl. She's before puberty. At puberty, okay. As a matter of fact, the Kalabari will even say she blossoms. When a girl goes into puberty, they say, look at her, she's blossomed. Her breasts she's blossomed. My former student, Catherine Daly, has some of that in her dissertation. So it's all biological. The whole thing is a female is supposed to go through the stages to become a mother. And that is the epitome, becoming a mother. So each biological stage, you go through puberty, you develop breasts, you menstruate, then, you're able to be married, you're married. And then if a woman is married and doesn't have a child, it's really a pity. I mean, it's you're supposed to have a child. And so that's why the celebration is when she has a child. And it's really interesting. If you go through this process that I called IRIA, IRIA, you're actually sequestered and your family takes care of you and they help take care of the baby and they feed you and they bathe you and they, make you feel really good about having a child. It would be a great piece of research to find out if they ever have, what do you call it, when people are all upset after, what do you call it, after having a child, when you have depression and everything. What's the word I want?
Postpartum depression.
Yes, exactly. Postpartum depression would be a fabulous piece of research to see if there has been postpartum depression when women are taken care of like that after the birth of a baby, because think of what we do. You come home and you've got this baby and you got to take care of it, and you don't know what to do if it's your first baby and so on, so and so this is very contrary to the kinds of things that we think today about gender and about equality and how we should have the same opportunities, and we really, I don't know if the word is downplay, but because we're so much focused on males and females having some of the same opportunities, that this whole thing about being focused on the sociobiological aspects of being female is just, we don't consider it right now. Or if we do, we downplay it or something like that. Does that make more sense?
Yeah. Because I
It may
also have
not
to
be
remember that's like
It
tradition.
may not be acceptable to what you'd like to believe, but that's the way it was. That's the way they do look at it. And I do think you might be interested, some of you who have who are from Asian families. It's very common in China, and I think it's also common maybe in Korea and Japan. But there is a joke about a Christmas cake. Have any of you heard about someone being a Christmas cake? Well, as it was explained to me when I was in China, when someone's called a Christmas cake, it means that they're over 25 and they're not married, because a Christmas cake is no good after Christmas, the 25th of December. And so it's like, it's a bad joke. But so if you are in a family and you wish your daughter was married and she's over 25 and somebody says, well, I'm sorry, she's a Christmas cake.
Mm.
So it does still exist in some cultures, even today, with the desire that a woman be married. And I think kind of historically, we've probably found that much more in terms of pressure on women. We seem to have had, if we're just looking at it factually, not in terms of how we want it, but we seem to have a lot more leeway in terms of men and age. Like we think men can be older and still be the father of a child, whereas biologically it doesn't happen that way as easily for a woman. Apparently it does happen as easily for men and so on. So across cultures, we do have a lot of these biological expectations for women and marriage and motherhood.
Professor Eicher, I have to just interject because it's 11:58.
Right,
It is
right,
so
right.
wonderful that you came to FIT to give this wonderful talk, and it is an amazing conclusion to my class, History of East Asian Costume. So some of you can remain here, but the reason I am interrupting is students have to go to another class at 12
Yes,
or
of
12:10.
course, of course.
So please put reaction emoticons 804 Professor Eicher. Do you see what I am doing? You know, clapping hands. You cannot hear, but Professor, can you see? Like we have
I
all
can
these
see. Thank
icons.
you very much. Thank you.
It is amazing. It is such a privilege to have you here. And, you know, students in my class, you can log out and I'll see you next week. And if you're ready for May 3rd presentation, get ready. And Professor Kawamura, the students, I guess you know what to do, right? Professor Kawamura?
Yes, yeah, my class can log out also. But one quick question to you, Professor Pyun.
Yeah.
Where are you going to post this recorded lecture today?
So I am recording, and once it is done, I can share the file link with you, Professor Kawamura, so you can send it to your students. And my students, you can find it in my Blackboard. I send the announcement. So I know, you know, you have to go, so you can, you know, go to another class, but you can, you know, linger here, and Professor Eicher can talk to you more, because it's only, what, 10:59 in Minnesota, right? It's only in the morning still.
That's right. That's right.
So anyhow, bye everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, Joanne. Nice
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Nice to see you.